Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones' unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. This podcast is being recorded on June 21st, 2024. Amy Stewart is the New York Times bestselling author of The Drunken Botanist, Wicked Plants, and several other popular nonfiction titles about the natural world. She's also written several novels in her beloved Kopp Sisters series. Her books have sold over 1 million copies worldwide and have been translated into 18 languages. You might have heard Amy on NPR's Morning Edition or Fresh Air, or seen her profiled in the New York Times. Her checkered television career includes CBS Sunday Morning, Good Morning America, and the PBS documentary The Botany of Desire. Amy's 2009 book, Wicked Plants, was adopted into a national traveling exhibit, and she's won a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the American Horticulture Society's Book Award, and an International Association of Culinary Professionals Food Writing Award. Amy travels the country as a highly sought-after public speaker whose spirited lectures have inspired and entertained audiences at college campuses such as Cornell and Harvard, corporate offices like Google, conferences and book festivals, botanic gardens, bookstores, and libraries nationwide. Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast, Amy. We are so delighted that you could be with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Amy, wonder if we could just learn a little bit about you and maybe walk us through your journey and how you found yourself to be a horticultural and garden writer.
Sure. So, I'm the author of over a dozen books. I think this is book number 14. And my first 6 books were all about the plant world in one way or another. And starting out, I just wanted to write books. I just wanted to be a writer. And so I wrote about the only thing that was going on in my life at the time, which is that I was planting a garden for the first time. So my first book was a memoir about my first garden in Santa Cruz as a young adult. And every book just led to the next one. It would be something in one book that got me curious about another thing. So I wrote a book about earthworms. I wrote a book about the global flower industry and one about poisonous plants. And then The Drunken Botanist is about all the plants we turn into alcohol. And in every case, it was just sort of like I would become curious and interested in something. And then I'd have to go out and find experts and ask them all the questions. I always tell people, I am not an expert in anything. I talk to experts. I interview experts. So that's really how that journey has happened. I've also written a bunch of novels. I've sort of done both fiction and nonfiction. But in every case, it was just, I want to find out more about this thing. And let me see if I can convince a publisher that this is also interesting.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Texas. I grew up in Dallas-Fort Worth, went to school in Austin. I'm a 5th generation Texan at heart.
Okay. And did you have early gardening, tree, or horticulture experiences that you feel like might have made an impression on who you would become as an adult?
Absolutely none.
Okay.
I grew up in the suburbs in Dallas-Fort Worth, and we had this thing called yard work. And that was how my brother earned his allowance, and I earned my allowance by doing the dishes. So no, there was no getting out there in 100-degree heat mowing the grass. That was not my jam.
Oh, darn. There goes that story narrative. Okay.
Well, but you know what then happened is that I moved to Santa Cruz, California. And
Okay.
Santa Cruz is the perfect place to be a gardener, right? Like it's fantastic temperature. Everything grows there year round. So that's where it started. How can you not garden in Santa Cruz, you know?
There you go.
Yeah.
I think that's really fantastic. You know, you were talking a little bit about how you make your selection of your next subject matter, but can you dive a little bit deeper into that and tell us, once you make a decision on the topic, how do you go from there? What is your modus operandi from there?
Yeah. So starting out, it really is a little bit like falling in love, you know, like it's very easy to be out on a walk and chatting with someone and you look at something and you ask a question and you think, is there more to that? And by the time you get back home, the book has sort of already bloomed in my mind, you know, like, wow, is this a thing? But then, yeah, the next step is I have to do a lot of research and find out if there's really a story there. And fortunately for me, the way I work is that my first step has to be to write a book proposal. Right there, I have a little guidance, like I got to come up with 20 to 40 pages, which means I need to start figuring out who to interview. For instance, I wrote The Drunken Botanist. I needed to talk to botanists who specialized in some of the plants that we turn into alcohol. So who can I talk to about agave, which gets made into tequila? Who can I talk to about barley? I mean, y'all know, name a plant and there is a person who's devoted their life to that plant and they will tell you everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah. So it's usually getting on the phone with a bunch of experts and talking to them and also digging through historical archives because I love history. So it's like, how far back can I trace our relationship with this plant? And what can I tell people that they don't already know? What can I find that isn't on Wikipedia? What can I dig out that no one's ever seen, that you can't Google it? So I'm always like, are those gems out there that I can find?
So when you're digging, it's almost like being an anthropologist, I would imagine.
Yes.
You have to kind of dig around carefully so that you don't destroy the structure of what you're trying to find.
Right.
I read a little bit about your
Kopp Sisters. Yeah.
the Kopp Sisters, the background of that. And I was really fascinated how you wound up writing a whole series on a woman who was one of the very first detectives in our country. Like, I mean, how do you find that? How do you find where she was and what she was doing? And because there might not have been written documentation, but maybe files from the people that she caught or something like that.
Yeah. So this is a story that I stumbled across by accident while I was working on Drunken Botanist. I was looking for a gin smuggler named Henry Kaufman, who I was going to put in Drunken Botanist. And I went into newspapers.com to see if there were any more articles about his gin smuggling behavior. And I just found a lot of other people named Henry Kaufman who'd gotten up to all kinds of things in the 1910s and 20s. And one of them was involved with a run-in with these three sisters living in New Jersey that resulted in one of those three sisters becoming a deputy sheriff. And it's one of those things where, you know, my day's going along. I'm trying to wrap up a page of work in the Drunken Botanist. And next thing you know, I'm completely derailed. And I'm digging into the 1910s in New Jersey. And I'm following these sisters. And I'm down this rabbit hole. And I've got nothing else done all day. And from there, it was a lot of newspaper research, a lot of genealogy. So building out their family tree and ancestry.com. And then reaching out to genealogists who know how to go into county clerk's offices and get out records that you can't get online, and reaching out to local historians who live in that community. It was this huge project to pull this story up that nobody knew and no one was really talking about. They'd been completely forgotten. And I just got obsessed with them and fell in love with them. I mean, what you might be figuring out is that I'm super interested in people, actually. I write a book about earthworms. It's kind of about earthworms, but it's a lot about earthworm scientists. With Flower Confidential, like it's sort of about flowers, but really it's about people who work in the flower industry. This new one, Tree Collectors, is definitely people's stories who collect trees. It's all about the people, and the trees are along for the ride in a way.
I loved reading this book, and I have to share with our listeners that not only is Amy a fantastic writer, an award-winning writer, but she's also a wonderful artist. And I follow her on Facebook and I get your mail.
Oh, right.
And I'm just overwhelmed with how you are able to write, and you painted and drew the drawings that are in the book.
Yeah, they're lovely.
What I really like about it is the fact that we typically don't see drawings in a nonfiction book like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really makes it very human, and it ties us to the natural world the way you do it. And to me, that is really refreshing. And you don't just have to read the whole thing all at once. You could read bits and pieces.
Right. Yeah.
And feel very content. This is something that you can read if you allow yourself 15 minutes before I go to bed. I always go, okay, I can read like 15, half an hour. Okay. And then I put it away and I'll say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to read the next 3 or 4. So it's really a wonderful book. I have to commend you on it. It's fabulous.
Well, thank you. You know, you're one of the first people to see this book. They've just landed in the warehouse. And so there were very few copies that were air freighted over ahead of the rest that you got. So I really appreciate what you said about the drawings feeling very human, because that was exactly the word I used to describe my goal with illustrating this book. I didn't want to use photographs, in part because these people are all over the world. And I was writing this book when we were still sort of under lockdown and travel was hard and being present with other people was hard. But also, I felt that by drawing them kind of in the style I would use if I was right there, if I was sitting in your backyard, what could I get done in a sketchbook? It's not an elaborate studio painting that I'm going to labor over for weeks. It's something I'm going to do in the moment. And so I wanted them to have that feel of immediacy, but also for the drawings to feel really accessible in a way. I want people to look at this and go, I could draw like that. Like you could learn how to do this too. And I did think that there was this human quality to having it feel very hand-drawn and not as polished and slick as what you might see in other illustrated books. So thank you. That makes me very happy.
Hal and I, we would get on the phone once a week and we'd say, what do you think? It's fantastic. We had another author too. We were reading her book, which was also wonderful. And it's refreshing. That's the one thing that I can actually say. It's refreshing because I read so many books and most of them nonfiction. And as an educator, I have to always keep myself fresh. And this kept me fresh and it kept me happy while I was reading it.
Good.
What did you learn, Amy, about this tribe of people called tree collectors? Maybe before we get into the weeds and meet a few of them, tell us about what you learned about the mindset of people that begin to collect trees or parts of trees.
Right. Yeah, no.
The pine cone lady.
You don't have to have a huge plot of land and grow trees to be a tree collector. There's a lot of ways to do it.
Right.
But I can honestly say that of all the books I've ever written, this is the one that surprised me the most as I started writing it. My expectation going in was that I was going to write a book about tree geeks, right? People who just geek out about a certain plant.
Right.
And we all know lots of those people, right? We know plant geeks of all stripes.
Yep.
And I thought that's what it was going to be. We're going to nerd out about Japanese maples, and then we're going to go nerd out about conifers, and we're going to nerd out about palm trees.
Yeah, right.
And I'm married to a rare book dealer. So the notion of being a collector and the personalities of collectors, that's really familiar to me. And I know that they've got a very particular mindset and just a craving to have one of everything, or a craving to round out whatever their little narrow niche is. So I thought that's what this book was going to be. That's what I told my publisher it was going to be. And then I started talking to people and I realized that these were people whose lives have been transformed by their relationship with trees in a way that I had not expected. Even as long as I've been around plants and people, and I know what a wonderful thing it is for all of us to be connected to nature, this went way beyond that. People who have built incredible communities because of their tree collection. People who've healed from unbelievable loss. People who've managed to even go back generations and try to right the injustices of the past through their tree collection. It's no exaggeration. A lot of these conversations would make me cry. I was so moved. And I would cry when I wrote the little essay later because I was so genuinely touched. And this book actually made me question my life choices.
Yeah.
They actually made me say, why did I not get my hands on an acre of land in my 20s and plant trees on them so that today I could point to this thing and say, this is what my life has meant? It was so profound. So yeah, the book changed completely. And it's also interesting, I have to say, you guys know this, you'll very much recognize this. You know how like people who are not in our plant world, people who are not like super plant geeks, they can only listen to you talk about it for so long, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Whether it's your spouse or your friends or your neighbors or your coworkers or whoever it is, they've only got a limited amount of interest. So here I am calling people up and I am dying to hear, like, tell me everything about your passion for camellias. I want to know all of it. I am here for as long as it takes. And people light up when they realize, like, wow. Because a lot of times people even stop and they're like, are you sure you want to hear all this? I'm like, oh, yes, I'm completely fascinated. Please go on. And so when that happens, when you show up with such attention and interest and really joy, then they really open up. And so these extremely personal stories came out because I think they realized they're with somebody who really cares and really wants to know all of it. So it's amazing.
Can I ask you, when you're interviewing someone, how do you go about your interview? Do you record it? Do you write it down? What is your process?
I did these interviews on Zoom. I mean, thankfully, we all got a crash course in Zoom, literally all over the world.
Yeah.
I talked to people in China who were perfectly comfortable on Zoom, people in India, guy in Ethiopia. He's like, yep, I can do Zoom. So everyone all at once could. I record the interviews, but I also do a thing, and I learned this from Ira Glass at This American Life. This is his strategy, which I read about. I make an index of the interview as I go. So I number my paper 1 through 60, and I just watch the clock, and about once every minute or two, I write down a word or two to remind myself what they were talking about right then. So it could just say trip to Alaska, or it could say high school science teacher, just like a word or two. So then at the end of the interview, I don't really need a transcript because I've got an index and I can zip ahead. But of course, Zoom also gives us transcripts. The computer generates a transcript, and I'm sure you've used them and you know they're not super legible because computers aren't actually all that smart, as it turns out. But sometimes it helps to have that transcript. Sometimes it understands what you're saying well enough.
That's really clever.
That's my way of recording it and documenting it.
And I think that that's how some people do their notes for their podcasts too.
Mm-hmm. It helps a lot.
Yeah.
You can do it in the field too. A lot of recording apps for your phone will have a little button that's actually called index or marker or something. And every time somebody says something interesting, you hit the button and it just puts a little mark in the audio track. So you don't know what things are on those marks, but you know that you've got 24 places that you marked and you can zip around and find them and do your index later once you're not walking and talking. So yeah, that's how I do it.
That's wonderful. Well, do you want to get into a few of the stories? I was really excited to see that you had Dan Hinckley in here, the plant hunter.
Yeah, I didn't profile Dan Hinckley, but yes, he definitely comes up. Let me just sort of explain like who is and isn't in the world of plant collectors. There are definitely people who see themselves as like traditional tree collectors. And what I would mean by that is they've got a bunch of land. They have probably a focus of some kind, although sometimes that focus is just anything I can get my hands on that grows in this climate, but that's still a focus. Other people, it's super narrow, like only species oaks. And generally people like that belong to a tree collecting society, which is maybe how I found them in the first place. And they're kind of in that world. But I realized that if those were the only people I talked to in this book, then it would be a lot of people in North America and Europe. It would be a lot of people with enough wealth so that they own some land, which is an amount of wealth. And it turns out that that tends to be a lot of men and it tends to be a lot of white folks. So I knew right away, like, I want this to be a global book for one thing. I want to include women. I want to include people who aren't white. And I want to include people who aren't part of the usual suspects in terms of tree collecting. So in order to do that, I kind of expanded my search. Like I went looking for YouTubers and TikTokers who are super into plants. They don't belong to any tree collecting societies. They're off doing their own things. And I just looked for people around the world who did something that I called collecting, even though it didn't involve owning your own plot of land and putting plants in the ground. This could be like we were talking about earlier, someone who collects pine cones, or there's a guy in the book who collects wood samples. There's actually a wood collecting society. All their wood samples are of a uniform size, about the size of an iPhone, so that you can file them and have them in a drawer and you can collect wood from all over the world. But sometimes it's just people who are doing a tree cataloging project. You guys know about the Trees of Stanford project, to catalog every single tree on Stanford's campus. That's a type of collecting because you've rounded them up and described them and created almost a bibliography of those trees. So in that sense, anyone can be a tree collector. It does not take a lot of money or resources or even time. And any of us can start now. It's never too late.
I love the wood collecting samples. That kind of reminds me because I follow this guy on Instagram who does wood furniture. He gets the big logs and makes them into different things. And oh my gosh, he said, I picked this one because of the type of wood and take a look at this and look at that. And so when he gets done the piece, it's like a museum piece. And
right.
And it's so exciting.
And definitely, you can imagine, because I'm an artist, I was super interested in people who make art with trees in some way. So one example is Alpina Vij, and she's in Singapore. And she goes around and she collects leaves that have fallen off of trees and that are a little broken, as leaves are, right? They're cracked, they have holes in them. And she takes this incredibly fine gold thread, like made out of real gold. And she puts these meticulous little stitches in, and she repairs the leaf and mends it and heals it. And then she mounts those in like a shadow box looking type of frame so that it is preserved and you can hang it on the wall. And that's her art. And she even was going around for a while in her neighborhood with her needle and thread and repairing leaves that were still on the tree and just leaving them there. And she would put them on Instagram. So her friends would always go looking to see if they could actually find them. But the whole idea of I'm going to make this art and it stays with the tree. She told me that one of her friends looked at this kind of very careful and very precious way of mending this leaf and said, I wish someone would do that on the inside for me.
Wow.
And I just thought there is this beautiful spiritual sense of healing with that, right? And so that's like, you're a tree collector. Leaves are your collection, and they're very specific leaves. They're leaves that are broken that you're going to mend in a beautiful way. The brokenness is part of what makes them beautiful, right? So that's amazing. But then you have somebody like Sam Van Aken, who as an art student got interested in grafting as an art form because his grandfather or great-grandfather was a master grafter of fruit trees. And so he actually, as an art project, started learning about grafting and came up with this tree of 40 fruits. And anyone who knows about grafting trees knows that you don't do that in one afternoon.
No.
No, it's a long process. It actually takes years for him to do one tree. And sometimes you need inner grafts. In other words, he's like, I want to graft this cherry onto my plum stalk, and I need an intermediary grafting stock that will take that graft. So he's got to do that intermediary graft and let that grow out, and then he can add his cherry onto it. So these trees of 40 fruits are at museums around the country. They're at zoos or, other sorts of public places. There are like some fancy hotels who've had them put in, and they're on university campuses. And he still goes back and works on them year after year. And that's a great example of you can have a tree collection with just one tree in your backyard.
And call it the learning tree.
Totally. And not only that, but he points out that it's a great way to have just the right amount of fruit. So rather than have more cherries than you can possibly eat all come ripe in a week, he has trees that are producing fruit from June through September.
I love that.
And you're just getting a handful of fruit every week. It's just enough for your breakfast and you're good.
Right. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Wow. Yeah.
That was a great story. And of course, it takes a lot of tenacity to be able to do something like that, not only to develop the art, but then to be patient enough for the art to be formed.
Sure.
Most definitely. Can you tell a little bit about the camellia story?
Oh, yes. Florence Crowder. You're going to keep hearing me say like, oh, this was my really favorite one.
Yeah.
They're kind of all my favorite. But I love Florence Crowder in part. She's in Louisiana and I'm from Texas. And she sounds just like my grandmother and all my grandmother's sisters. So I felt like I'd gotten another grandmother when I met Florence. So Florence Crowder, she collects camellias, and her dad was a home builder after World War II. You know, he's going around building starter homes for people. And as a gift, a lot of times to new homeowners, he would give them a camellia tree. And he had camellias in his own backyard as well. So when her dad died and she had the estate to deal with, she had all these camellia trees and she suddenly got curious about them. Like our parents' hobbies seemed sort of ridiculous to us when we were kids. It's like, oh, Dad, we got to go to another tree nursery this weekend. And it took her whole life, really, until she's dealing with his estate for her to get curious about them. And once she started looking into them and trying to identify which camellia varieties she had inherited, she realized how much we don't know about camellias and how many lost camellia varieties are out there. And she undertook this project to find as many of them as she could and see if they could be grafted or cloned, because camellias are not a very long-lived tree. There's plenty that are in the records. They were maybe sold by a nursery and it's in a 100-year-old nursery catalog somewhere, but nobody seems to have one anymore. And if we don't find one pretty quick, there's not going to be any more around because camellias don't live forever. So she's become this camellia hunter, and that's what she does, is goes around and tries to collect them. At her local university there in Louisiana, there's a small collection now that's named after her, and she has 3 camellias that are named directly after her, which I have little pictures of in the book. So it's just such a cool project. And, you know, she's also like the unofficial historian of her little town. And she talks about how, you know, the reason these are worth saving is because they were once here and people once cared about them. And someone once thought enough of this to give it a name and to put it out there. And so that should matter to us. As someone who loves history myself, I love that.
And of course, it's one of the oldest cultivated plants in the world.
That's right.
Yeah, it goes back, was it 3000 BC, something like that?
Yeah. And so the International Camellia Society, they used to publish books, and of course now it's a database, but they're going back through old records to see what they can document. And they have documented going back to the 1600s, which is very impressive.
Yes, it is. Well, I don't think we can even do that with apples because there's so many of them.
So a couple of years ago, Amy, my nephew in Colorado Springs, as we all do, sent me a link, and it was an edgy punk rock kind of guy with a heavy Chicago accent. And I saw my first Joey Santor video.
Yes.
Not only was he a brilliant botanist, or is a brilliant botanist, but he had a sense of humor, very edgy. And this was one of his first rollouts where he's at a homeless encampment outside of Oakland.
Okay.
What was it like chasing down Joey Santor, and how did that go? And he's a fellow Chicagoan.
Oh, nice. Yeah, no, it was great. Fortunately, a friend of a mutual friend made introductions. And yeah, if anyone hasn't ever heard of him, he's got this YouTube channel called
Crime Pays.
Crime Pays, but Botany Doesn't. Sometimes I get those mixed up and I'm like, no, Crime Pays, but Botany Doesn't.
Yeah.
And they are hilarious and interesting. And they're the most spirited, coolest, most wonderful about a broad range of topics in botany.
Yeah.
But what interested me, you know, with all these people, like these are multidimensional people, and yet I had 2 pages. So I had to condense down.
Yes.
So what I specifically wanted to talk to him about was his unauthorized forestry project.
Yes.
You know, we've heard of guerrilla gardening, but guerrilla tree planting takes it to a whole new level. And so MacArthur Boulevard in Oakland had a big wide median strip, and a lot of the original plantings had died. And he just saw that as an opportunity. He's like, well, I'm going to start putting some of my plants in here. And he had like some cool, unusual plants that are definitely not on the city street tree list, you know? So he's putting those in and taking care of them, and sometimes having loads of wood chips delivered, and took this over as his. And I loved that idea. I thought, okay, well, we've all heard of like make a seed bomb and toss it into a vacant lot and some poppies might grow out of it. But it never occurred to me to get my hands on a tree and go looking around for some municipal or otherwise available but not my piece of land, and just decide it needs a tree, and then to kind of like keep an eye on it and nurture it along. So I was just thrilled and delighted with that idea. And it does feel like this very renegade punk rock way to be a tree collector, is your tree collection is just in a parking lot at a shopping center. And you're like, yep, I planted that one. That's mine.
Yeah. And subsequent to leaving Oakland, he's been throughout Texas. Mm-hmm. He's been throughout the American Southwest. Yeah. He's been in the mountains in Mexico. And man, he really knows his plants.
Oh, yes.
Top to bottom.
Yes, he does. One of the things that I really came to appreciate writing this book is the botanical richness of Mexico.
Yeah.
Which I think we overlook. And part of it is that maybe there's not as strong of a conservation program as we might wish there was in Mexico. But many tree collectors I talk to, the oak collectors, are all very into going and looking for not new, but new to them, oak varieties. Yeah, there's real botanical richness there. And I hope it gets preserved and taken care of.
Yeah, and I think also we talk a lot about assisted migration. And here in the American Northeast today, we've got a heat dome, we've got drought conditions and temperatures in the upper 90s. So you have to think that some of these plants from Mexico are going to be able to be brought north and get established and survive in some of these climatological zones.
That came up a lot with tree collectors. One of the other almost spiritual themes that runs through the book is that when you plant a tree, you're planting something that's going to outlive you.
Yeah.
It's going to be here after you're gone.
Right.
So what that means is that you have to think about a future that you're not going to be in. So with trees, that means thinking about the climate of the future. And that's something that a lot of tree collectors talk about. And the best example from the book is Dave Muffley, who was super into California oaks. And he's like the California oak guy. But like everybody, I have to focus on one little tiny piece of their life story. And so that piece was that he was summoned by Steve Jobs to think about the kind of trees that Steve wanted on Apple's campus in Northern California. And it turns out Steve was a tree fanatic. And when Dave Muffley started talking to him about California oaks and about climate change and what's going to be growing here in 40 years, Steve understood that completely. And he was immediately on board with that. So they planted a very forward-thinking collection of trees on the Apple campus as a result. So yeah, that comes up a lot. You know, I love talking to Dean Swift, who's in here as a seed collector. It's not a hobby for him. It's a profession. He goes around and gathers seed from conifers in the American West. But he really taught me that even within a very particular species, you're going to have variations that have to do with the climate that they're acclimated to. And that tree nurseries, especially the big forestry departments, are really looking at that and saying, I want this ecotype that's a little bit earlier or a little bit later, or it's a little more drought tolerant, or it's a little taller or a little shorter. So now we're really looking more at variations within one tree population. And that was fascinating. That was something I didn't know a lot about.
Yeah, when we interviewed Dave Muffley, we had a great time with him hearing that story, or some of it at least. And I appreciated so much hearing about the Arboretum, or the collection that Dave and Steve Jobs put together, and also remembering how it was one of the storylines in The Overstory. Just overcoming serious handicaps and then visualizing through his tech-oriented brain what trees are, what trees can become, and what trees mean to technology and programming. It's all connected, isn't it?
It is all connected. It was interesting for me. I had not read Overstory before I started the book, and I tend to stay away from books that are like the one I'm writing.
Right.
So by the time I picked it up, it was so interesting because, you know, you hear themes over and over again from tree collectors. So in Overstory, the American chestnut is there.
Right.
Trees of Stanford, the Stanford campus is there. So I'm like, oh, wow, we've sort of been swimming around in the same pool here a little bit. That was cool.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the Mexican collection of plants, we had Dave Tuschler on from Devil Mountain Nursery, and he was talking about how far down they go to collect seed, and even bringing some things from Mexico up into planting so that they can put it in the lower parts of California. The plant might do really well. And I remember when the garden communicators went to Oklahoma, I think it was Oklahoma, where I saw the subspecies Mexicana of the Cerasus canadensis, the redbud. And it was much thicker, shinier leaves, tougher, one that would be much more resilient than our own because of the location of where it's coming from. And to me, that really sparked my interest in looking at subspecies where you can actually get something that's going to be, like you're saying, different, tougher, more resilient in a location that is further south.
Right.
And bringing up further north, and it's still cold hardy too. So at the same time, you're actually bringing something that's going to be here longer, like you mentioned, past our lifetimes.
Right.
That's really something to think about.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in with a quick nerdy observation since I think I'm amongst peers here. Just driving through a row house neighborhood yesterday, again, tying this into redbuds, and another tree that Eva knows well for an iconic Philadelphia street tree is London Plane. So they're side by side on Olney Avenue, Eva.
Yes, I know Olney well.
And the redbud had a little bit of a semi-weeping form and not more than 12 feet tall, but mature, nice crown spread. And the London Plane was doing its thing, 55 feet, branches starting out at about 25, 30. And just kind of glancing off to the side as I drove, noticing how the redbud was really offering much more shade on a little, probably like a 10 by 10. Whereas the big upper story, overstory London Plane, it was more filtered light, but much more penetration. And I just thought, as a human, I'd rather be standing under this little redbud today than the London Plane. So that's my observation that I'll share.
And what I was going to say is that the London Plane can let the light through so that redbud can live underneath it.
There we go.
That's true.
Thank you.
Because of the filtered light.
Yes.
That's what big trees do. They don't give you as thick a shade, but they certainly do give you filtered light so that you still can get some sunlight underneath it for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about.
I was just going to say, there's an interesting little microcosm in that when you look at these tiny forests. I ended up talking to, coincidentally, 2 different people.
That's right.
In the book who are interested in this idea of tiny forests, which is of Japanese origin. But the idea that we're going to plant very densely with unusually thoroughly amended soil, a very different approach to soil preparation, but that we're going to do every layer of the forest all at once and everything's going to compete. And at the end, years from now, it is going to be those tall trees and whatever survives in the shade underneath. But in between now and then, there's going to be extremely rapid growth and very vibrant root activity. And the idea that all of that can happen in your backyard, like these are meant to be forests that are the size of a tennis court, but I know people have even done them smaller than that.
Parking space size,
exactly.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
Such a cool idea and such a neat way to think about planting trees. But it is all about the layers with a tiny forest.
So there you can have your collection, but it's not a specific collection. It's a very vast collection because you're looking at multiple species rather than just one.
Exactly.
Which is really nice. That's a nice thing to do. It's catching on out in California. Neelam Patel, who is a teacher out there who's been working with the students.
Berkeley, I think.
It's in Berkeley, yeah. And
I love it.
Going gangbusters with her students. And even on these little narrow strips where, you have that heat coming off of it because it's asphalt, they break it open and they plant the trees. And all of a sudden you have this cool break in the middle of this hot parking lot.
Yeah.
And you say to yourself, wow, there's a collection of trees.
Absolutely.
Well, it sounds like you had a fantastic time meeting these beautiful people. And along the lines of Miyawaki and Tiny Forest, I did read through again, and I'll do my best on the pronunciation of Shubhendi Sharma. And just thinking about, here's this college-trained engineer. I mean, that's no small feat to get through engineering school, gets a job at Toyota, and then looks over at this gentleman planting a forest and realizing that's what I want to do.
Yeah. And this is another one of those stories that turned out to be so much more personal than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Because he talked about working at Toyota and how part of the Toyota way, the Toyota method, is to trace every part of the car all the way down the supply chain back to its original source, which is a natural source of some kind or another, like the tires, and you eventually get to rubber trees. And tracing them all the way back, what he realized in the process of doing that is that we're taking natural resources trees, and we're turning them into cars whose only destiny is to become junk. So they're all destined for the junkyard. And that what his job as an engineer and what everyone's job at the car manufacturers to do is to fight nature, because nature wants to do things like corrosion on metal, right?
Yeah.
You're applying chemicals and you're trying to stop nature from doing what nature wants to do. And it takes so much effort to stop nature. And he realized that planting tiny forests, for example, is nature does what nature wants to do. And it doesn't actually require a lot from us. You know, a tiny forest needs some tending in the first few years, but then you're supposed to go away and leave it alone. It's not for you. And it will take it from there. And, you know, that's actually interesting because there's a few people in the book who are doing restoration, but I tried to kind of draw a line between forest restoration and tree collecting. But nonetheless, sometimes I got so interested that I had to sort of let those lines blur a little bit. But there is this sort of interesting idea right now, I think, in ecological restoration of let's just stand back and do nothing. Let's let the plants do what they want to do. And even in New Zealand, I spoke very briefly with a guy in New Zealand who's working on this. And even letting the non-native species that are considered invasive, like recognizing that they have the ability to be the first plants in that the forest can follow, that they're sort of establishing. And so he let this gorse flourish and everyone was horrified because we've been spending our lives trying to get rid of it. And he was like, I'm going to let it go. And the trees are going to come in after it with very little interference from me. And he turned out he was right. But of course, it takes 30 years to prove you're right. But he was right. So fascinating ways of thinking about it, I think.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping you were going to get a shout out in today's New York Times because Margaret Roach profiled a couple of collectors.
Yeah.
Allison Levy and Scott Sherland. I don't know where Stone Ridge, New York is, but hopefully people are going to read this article and want to learn more about tree collectors because this team, they're often running with a bunch of things I'd never heard of in terms of fruits on vines, fruits on small trees.
Yes.
And not only that, but the struggles, the wins and the losses. Mm-hmm. You know, we all know in gardening and horticulture, it can be very unforgiving.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I tried to grow ginseng once and I gave up. Maybe it's time I circle back to that. Eva and I are big fans of Mike Gibson, who was into the Woody Plant Conference a couple of years on the Swarthmore campus. He was a very engaging speaker and a lovely person all the way around. And I know his mentor, I have the DVD that profiled him, but his name is escaping me.
I forget what his name is too, but
Pearl Fryer.
Pearl Fryer, yes.
Yes, Pearl Fryer. He was amazing.
Yeah, Mike was an absolute delight to talk to.
Yeah.
You know, you spend 5 minutes with Mike and you just want to be on the Mike Gibson train. Like wherever you're going, I want to go.
Yeah.
He is just overbrimming with joy and positivity and has so many incredible ideas. So he's from Youngstown, Ohio.
Right.
And so he came up with this project to plant topiaries as a beautification project all over the city. So he's another one who his tree collection isn't at his house. Like right now, he's living in a rented house in South Carolina, but he's like, you know, I had to do the bushes out in front and I've done my neighbors too. Like he's gone up and down the street.
Yeah.
And so what I love about Mike is the way his joy is contagious. Like it is actually infectious in the sense that he's going to come over to your house. And if he lives down the street from you, he's going to do yours too. And you're going to get on board with the topiaries, whether you're ready or not. So yeah, he's amazing. He's fantastic.
Yeah. He told the whole story of Pearl Fryer, a classic story of a person of color in the South trying to purchase a piece of real estate and trying to beautify and the pushback from the community. And, you know, like I said, he was in town a couple of years ago, but that story really stuck with me.
Yeah.
I'd like the section in your book on how to move a large tree because I've been following treemover.com.
Oh.
A company that we interviewed, environmental design group, and their tagline is Tree Mover. And we were asking them, how in the world did you move that big tree? And they said, oh, we went to NASA to find out how they use their technology to lift off rockets to see how we can lift off our trees or lift them out of the ground.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that's like amazing.
Yes.
They can put it on a barge. They can float it down a river. They can roll it up a hill and helicopter it in.
Yeah.
And they're moving trees that would normally be cut down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what really makes me happy, where
if
a tree has to come out take it out rather than cut it down.
Yes.
Especially if it's a really big old one. And the older, the better, seems like, because they have so much root mass and so much food within that root mass, that when we asked them how many trees they've lost, they said very, very few, 1 or 2 of all their transplants, hundreds and hundreds.
It's amazing what they can do. So I got interested in this idea of moving trees because I saw this movie called Taming the Garden. And if you get a chance to see it, go find it. I think actually it's now something you can sort of pay-per-view online. Last time I checked. And I interviewed the filmmaker. So she's in Georgia, meaning the nation of Georgia, not the state of Georgia in the U.S.
Right.
And there's this oligarch who wanted to have a huge tree collection, which did become a public park, but it's very much his fancy thing. And I wasn't going to get anywhere near that guy. He was not going to talk to me. So this filmmaker did talk to me about the documentary she did about his efforts to move these enormous trees. And it's in many ways a sad story because these are beautiful old trees that were out in the countryside and really poor people living around them, but they couldn't turn down the money. And they got some things in exchange, not just the money, but maybe a better road would be built because they would need it to get the equipment in and out, or some infrastructure improvements. But so it was very unsettling for me to see these enormous trees with these massive tree canopies on basically a flatbed trailer going down the street or on a barge floating across the water. And I just thought those were such unsettling images. And then, just like you, I really wanted to know, how do you do it? So fortunately, another one of the tree collectors in this book, Lucas Dexter, his dad, Dave Dexter, is very good at moving large trees in California. So he got on the phone with me and explained to me the different methods. And what I learned from him that really surprised me is that you don't have to dig real deep. You have to go wide. You need a root ball that's the width of the tree canopy, but the deep roots, the tap roots, are for stability. They're to provide a counterweight to the wind, and they're to anchor the tree, but the tree doesn't need them so much for growth. So he can do these really wide but surprisingly shallow trenches. And there's a lot of important things when you're moving a big tree, but one of them that I never would have thought of is that the growth hormones that the tree needs to survive are coming from the young growing shoots out at the ends of the branches. So the last thing you want to do is cut the tree back right before you move it. And this is tricky because you're trying to get it down streets. You got power lines to think about. You got overpasses to think about. You got to look at your route and figure out if you can really get a tree down there. But this Georgian oligarch didn't know any of that. And he would cut these trees way back, and then they wouldn't survive because of what he'd done to the top part of the tree, not so much the bottom part of the tree.
Wow.
So that's amazing. And also there is this high-end world, like out in the Hamptons and stuff. There's this high-end world of selling extremely posh trees. Like a thing I heard over and over again, it was about trees and time, right? So you plant a little tree and there's this added element of time before the tree matures. But wealthy people, the one thing money can't buy you is time. And so they try to buy time by buying mature trees. They could pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a mature tree. So you have someone in the Hamptons who's, like you said, for construction reasons, they're putting in a pool house and they got to get rid of this big, beautiful magnolia or beech or whatever it is. And a tree broker will come out and broker the deal, find a buyer for it, work out a price that includes the cost of moving it, and make that move happen. And I was like, wow, that's someone's job. I can't believe that's someone's job. But there it is.
Logistics in the best possible way.
Right.
Well, we could also do the carbon footprint conversion. So you're out in the Hamptons and you're going to move a 12-inch diameter weeping beech, dig it, get the backhoe out there, the tractor trailers, the crane. I'd say plan on planting about 2 million bare root trees to compensate your carbon footprint on that project.
I mean,
it's a lot.
Exactly. Right. The tree brokering among the rich and famous is a whole thing unto itself, for sure.
Yeah.
Not to change the subject, but you also have a really wonderful section in here called Living Fossils, which I think is really a good one. We talk about that in woody plant classes. You talk about the main hair tree, which is the ginkgo.
Sure.
I love the ancient trees and having these fossils in our midst. We get to see these unusual trees all unto themselves, the dawn redwood, the monkey puzzle.
Right.
That's another really good section I thought was really delightful to read about.
Yeah.
I like the way that ginkgo gentleman called it out in North America and said, your ginkgos, they're very different than what we have.
Right. So I really wanted a tree collector from China.
Yeah.
As I understand it, as an outsider, there isn't really still even today, a lot of private ownership of land in China. People might own their homes, but they don't own the land that it sits on. And the culture of collecting that we have in America, in North America, and in Europe isn't really a culture that's shared everywhere around the world. Again, this is about what are other ways I can define collecting. And I would ask everyone I knew about this, and who do you know in China? And a couple people pointed me to Jimmy Shen, who is a photographer who goes out and photographs some of the grand, old, magnificent ginkgo trees in China. And he's done this book where he talks about the history of them. And there are these wonderful, very personal stories about a very old male and female ginkgo tree. And they're like an old married couple. And people like to get married underneath those trees and hope that their marriage has the same longevity as those trees. And so that's a type of a tree collection because, of course, he can't very well go dig them all up and have them for himself, right? These are heritage trees that have to stay where they are. But just by naming them and telling their stories and photographing them and documenting them and remembering them, he has collected them in his own way. But yeah, he very much lectured me about our terrible ginkgo trees we have here in the US and how many more they have in China, and that they have the males and the females, and we tend to not have the females as often over here. And so that was fascinating to hear his perspective.
I had just heard something that just triggered something in my head that I think it's Washington, D.C. or someplace where it's illegal to plant a female ginkgo. And I was like, what? Why aren't they all female and not plant any males? Because...
Right. Why are we the ones who have to stay out? Exactly.
And I just thought that was really strange, but we don't revere the female ginkgo at all. Although they are very important for their seed for medicinal purposes.
Right. I think, as you know, it's a thing, particularly with street trees and municipal trees, that if there's a female tree that's going to drop a lot of fruit, that's going to cause problems on the sidewalks and on people's cars and so on and so forth. So we plant all these male trees, and then we suffer from this overabundance of pollen in the air because we have nothing but male trees sending their gift of pollen out to all the lady trees out there somewhere. Only there's no lady trees to enjoy it. So
that was interesting because I got a little note from Tommy Ogren, who is the allergy scientist. And he was saying you only need one male for 9 females for ginkgo. And he said the worst part is that the pollen from the ginkgo swims up your nose.
Yes.
It's one of the very few pollens that actually swims. So
I love his work so much. I interviewed him for Wicked Plants because I had a section on plants and allergies. I defined that as a kind of wickedness. And so, we had a fascinating talk about that.
He's really wonderful.
What's his last name?
Ogren. Ogren. Yeah. Well, I think that this book is spot on and it meets the mark for someone who wants to read about collectors. If you're a collector, I would definitely go out and buy the book.
Thank you.
I wanted to pitch to Amy my idea. I'm planted out here in Philadelphia. No more trees, no more room. But if I did have my 3 acres or an acre and a half, I've always wanted to have a collection tree-wise of horticultural oddities, horticultural failures, trees that maybe Princeton Nursery tried to sell 50 years ago. I put the quick list together. It would be pink flamingo, box elder, ruby frost, river birch, purple robe, black locust, which I think is still being sold, ruby lace, honey locust, a couple classics like the Camperdown elm. Because I grew up reading my grandparents' TV guide, the tree that was advertised on the back page was the Paulownia because it grows 10 feet a year.
Right.
The variegated Kentucky coffee tree that I saw in London and Lombardy poplar. And I think that's just the beginning of the list. But I think it would be fun to get those under one roof and then have someone like John Waters dedicated if he's still alive. I hope he is.
I think we could call this collection, It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time.
Perfect. We thought it was going to sell 1 million.
Right.
And it didn't.
It would actually be a fun art project to illustrate all of those.
Oh, yeah.
I can totally see this as a cute little illustrated book.
Yeah, and the poster.
Hilarious captions and stuff.
Right, right.
Amy, what is your favorite tree
Oh,
right now?
it's a hard question to answer, but I do live in the Pacific Northwest. And so my favorite trees are individual specific trees. So there's 2 different Douglas firs that I walk past every day on my walk that if I'm having a bad day, I hug them every time I walk past them and they always make me feel better.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I love those trees very much. But I have to say, there's a Himalayan cedar right outside my window that annoyed me so much when I moved in. It's down the street, but it just bothered me. It sort of looms over everything else and it's crooked and it blocks my view and it's uninteresting. But I've really just grown to love it because I wake up in the middle of the night and I look out my window and it's always there and it's kind of become my friend. So
Wow.
sometimes trees grow on you, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. That's a great one. We haven't had anybody say anything like that before.
I hate you, but I love you.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing all your knowledge on this new book, The Tree Collectors. Can you tell us where people can get it and give people your web address?
Yes. You can get the book everywhere books are sold. My website is amystewart.com. And you can find me there, and there's book tour dates, and there is a bookstore, Broadway Books here in Portland is going to do signed copies. So if anybody wants a signed copy, I'll go over there and sign them as soon as they get their shipment in, and they'll go out to people. So that's always an option as well.
Fantastic.
That's great for the collectors.
For tree collectors, yes.
Well, thanks again. We really appreciate it and wish you all the best. Continued success with all your writing. I can't wait to see what your next book's going to be.
Thank you. This was so much fun. I love talking about trees with people who are such tree lovers. So this is the best.
Likewise. It's a blessing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Same here.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The Planet Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.